Hello, I'm recording this to try and help people who may be having to change their research designs because of the inability to collect primary data. So I've titled this session Analysing Documentary Data. I'm a professor of strategy at Durham University Business School. My name's Kevin Morell. Prior to that I was at Rhetoric Business School. I've been a British Academy Mid-Career Fellow and I also have links to practice. So the overall aim is going to be to illustrate the potential of documentary analysis, because a lot of people will be having to shift away from, let's say, doing interviews or observation to an alternative method. And the reason for doing this is because of so many people having to rethink their research designs. I'm going to talk about documentary data in broad terms, but I'm going to focus mainly on using narrative and rhetoric, and I'm going to show examples of where I've been successful in publishing with those methods. So in terms of the contents or the structure, first I'm going to say something about documentary data, its advantages and disadvantages, kinds of data. Then I'm going to contrast narrative and rhetorical analysis with content analysis, which is the mode of analysis that a lot of people will be familiar with when it comes to looking at qualitative data, but it has its limits. Then I'm going to go into more detail on some more advanced themes to do with the nature of language. My focus, my background is on organisation theory, so I'm coming from that perspective. Also going to talk about discourse, and then formalism, which is an approach to using narrative, looking at texts through the lens of narrative and also rhetoric. Then give some example publications and some resources. Initially then, documentary data. So on the plus side, if you're having to rethink the research design that you've got in mind initially for your project, whether that's for a dissertation or for a longer project like a thesis, there are lots and lots of different kinds of documentary data that you can draw on. So again, I mentioned from a business or management organizational perspective, you can look at annual reports, forms by the companies, the kinds of documents that accounting data is made up of, or HR data, organizational charts. There's a lot of literature and policy that could be relevant to people depending on the topic area, legislation and so on. I won't go through all of these, but I'll pick up a couple of important points. First, the bottom bullet on the left-hand side, existing databases. So there are already a lot of different sources of qualitative data, including interview data, which are publicly available. So you can draw on interview data that somebody else has already been carried out if you can locate it and make it relevant to your project. There's a link there for one repository. A second thing to mention is, I've used the phrase in the right hand side, it's the fifth or sixth bullet down, corpora. There are bodies of texts that are already out there and that can be analysed using a method called corpus linguistics. There's not time to go into that, but essentially if you're following a corpus linguistic approach, all the data is already out there, all the tools, things such as Sketch Engine, British National Corpus, these bodies of texts are already out there. So if you can make your research design fit one of those, or draw on existing interview data, that might be one way to get over the challenge of not being able to get primary data, some kinds of primary data. Let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of documentary data. Well, one of the key advantages is, if you think of the term data in its roots, it means something given to you. Documentary data is given to you. It's not something that you go and collect and create or construct or find. Now, that has its disadvantages because you're not getting primary data, but it is a great advantage because you've got a firm place to stand in a way when you're carrying out your analysis, because nobody can challenge you on how you've created or constructed that data set. It's what we call unobtrusive, and it's non-reactive. So your role as a researcher doesn't directly influence that data because it's already out there in the way that an interview would or an observation would. And there's this phrase, dead social science researcher test, which is a bit morbid perhaps, but essentially the kind of data that you get doing documentary analysis passes what's sometimes called the dead social science researcher test. With an interview, that wouldn't have happened if the social scientist had died on the way to carrying out the interview. But with documentary data, it's already there, so it would already be in the world. It can offer a basis for triangulation, a basis for comparison and contrast with other methods, and you can triangulate different secondary sources of data. So you can triangulate policy documents with organisational documents, for example. One thing that you might not think of, a real advantage, is that it encourages ingenuity when it comes to analysing this data. Because it's already out there, for you to be able to say something novel and insightful that's a contribution about it, you actually have to say something which is quite innovative. So it encourages ingenuity. Unlike with primary data, when you're looking at documents, you can look at them over time. So there is longitudinal scope, so you've got more scope to claim what things have happened over time, and then maybe even get as close to saying something about cause and effect. Let's look at the disadvantages then. You've no influence on the methods or the methodology, so you can't collect survey data without either you doing a survey or somebody else having done a survey. It can be difficult to identify the authors in some kinds of documents. If they're organisational documents, you don't know who's written them necessarily. If they're policy documents, it could have been a team of people. And that can mean it's a little harder to talk about intent, what somebody means within a document, unlike with, say, an interview. A disadvantage in terms of selection is that you're bound by what's already out there. So you might have a limited source of data to select from, a limited number of data items or documents. But as I mentioned in the previous slide, there are loads and loads and loads, lots and lots of opportunities to carry out documentary analysis. Access or ethics considerations, you might not be able to get access to some sources of documentary data depending on how you want to carry out the research. Ethical considerations don't go away just because that data has already been collected. You still need to think about, the kind of maybe some of the same principles that there are with processing personal data. A question you might have, this might be true for your thesis, your dissertation, or it could be true for trying to publish a journal article. The question the reviewers might have is it enough data? And they might have in mind a typical kind of qualitative methods, a typical kind of data set, a certain number of interviews. Maybe it would already have had documentary data in there, as a kind of triangulation. But you might have to work a little harder to convince reviewers or your examiner that the data that you have is enough. Overall, though, there is a constraint. There are multiple constraints with working with documentary data, but it also does represent an opportunity. So don't feel that you're forced into an inferior route if you're looking for documents that can help address your research questions. There's just as much scope to make a theoretical contribution. There's just as much scope to do something insightful and innovative. Some people have even argued that we already have enough data, but what we don't have is well analysed data. So some people would say it's a better use of time to look at what data sources are already out there and what you can learn from those than it is to design a survey or to carry out new interviews. Let's think quickly about the difference between content analysis and narrative and rhetorical analysis. And this first part of the presentation is kind of enough for an introduction, and I'll go on to later themes, more advanced themes in a little bit. In each of these cases, content analysis versus narrative and rhetorical analysis, I'm going to go through the steps you would have in research design, give you an example, and then briefly an exercise. So the steps in content analysis. So you start with the research question. For example, why are nurses saying they quit their jobs? You decide on a sampling strategy. I'm going to look at voluntary leavers at 8 organisations, NHS organisations or trusts in the year 2000 to 2001. Define the recording unit. So what kinds of key themes are you expecting to crop up? Training, promotion, pay, and so on. Additional categories for analysis. Now, when you are doing content analysis, you want to have what are called exhaustive and mutually exclusive codes. So they need to be exhaustive because you need to cover everything in your data set with these codes, and they need to be mutually exclusive so that if you use one coding frame to analyse one piece of text, it doesn't cross over into other pieces of text. I'll show what that means in more detail with an example. It'll be simpler to understand then. So you might have promotion, training and development, but you can already see a potential problem if, for instance, the ability to not have promotion opportunities is linked to development opportunities. You want these codes to be exhaustive but also mutually exclusive. And then you might aggregate those up into bigger categories, so work and non-work related in that example. So that's the steps. An example here is a coding frame. Now this could have been the kind of data that an organisation collects with its exit interviews. So if you were able to get access to those exit interviews, you could do this kind of study. And then there are example extracts at the bottom, and there's the idea of a coding frame is that you analyse the content of what people say, and you're able to allocate it to different categories. So if we look at just the first example, where it says number 1023, codes 196, the extract from a document such as an exit interview might say cost of fuel, spend more time with family. And then if you look at the codes in the coding frame, 19 is travel problems on the top right, and 6, some way down on the list of the left, is personal family problems or pressures. So you get the logic of that coding frame, and those 33 codes should be mutually exclusive. So if you code something as 19, you don't also code it as 18 or 17 or whatever. They should also be exhaustive, so no matter what the extract says, you're able to apply a coding frame, and this is the logic of content analysis. Now, just as a quick example, an exercise, these are other extracts that you could then apply the coding frame to. So would have stayed but fed up with training needs not being met in work time, had to do training on days off unpaid. And you could work through this exercise yourself using that coding frame, but the main thing to say is once you do this, it shows that it's difficult to have mutually exclusive and exhaustive codes. So essentially, content analysis, which is like a kind of realist model of how qualitative data maps onto the world, is limited. Take this first example, would have stayed but fed up with training needs not being met in work time, had to do training on days off unpaid. So that could be relating to pay, 27, because it says about not being paid for training time. It could also have been related to 23, no development or refused opportunity. It could also be related to number 9, promotion or career development. You could even say that it was down to being short-staffed or under-resourced because the training needs were only met unpaid, because there weren't enough staff to cover the shifts otherwise, perhaps. So the idea of this example, the steps in the content analysis seem very logical and clear. The goals of exhaustive and mutually exclusive seem very logical and clear. Once you work through it, you see there are limitations to this approach. So basically, the model of being able to map something that is qualitative data onto the world can be limited. Let's look at a completely different approach now, and this is what most of the presentation that I'm going to talk through is on, narrative and rhetorical analysis, and I'm using them both together. So in a narrative analysis, you start again with a research question. So this is a policy document. How does the white paper Choosing Health justify reforming the NHS? And then you decide what are the relevant documents to help you answer that research question. So here there's a white paper, that's a policy paper, and other policy literature. CHI is just a body that produced those policy literature documents relating from 2000 to 2005. Now, instead of trying to map the content of what is said, you're looking at content, but you're also looking at the way content is organised, and you're trying to think of it not just as a factual case of corresponding, qualitative data mapping onto a coding frame. You're trying to think more deeply about the story that's being told, the kind of themes, plots, rhetorical devices, how that story is being put together. You might look at other potential narratives. You're not just bound by what's written in the policy document. You might think about what wasn't written, why wasn't it written, why wasn't it put another way. So it's a very different approach from a realist mapping of a bit of qualitative data onto a coding frame. You're thinking much more about themes and plots, rhetorical devices, other potential narratives. And this approach will become clearer as I go through the rest of the slides in the presentation. But here's an example. This is from the white paper Choosing Health, which is a policy document on healthcare. And that's a direct quote from that document. In the same way as we were taking a quote from the extracts of people who had left and exit interviews in the examples for content analysis earlier. So that white paper that policy document begins, at the start of the 21st century, England needs a new approach to health of the public, reflecting the rapid and radical transformation of English society in the latter half of the 20th century, responding to the needs and wishes of its citizens as individuals, harnessing the new opportunities open to it. Now, from a content analytic perspective, you could say, well, there's a reference to society, there's a reference to the 21st century, there's a reference to transformation, there's a reference to citizens, and you could design a coding frame that would go through that white paper and would have, ideally mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories. But with a narrative approach, what we're interested more deeply in is who's written it, what the purposes of that are, and what's the story. So we can identify things like rhetorical devices, things that make the story more compelling and more powerful, and other potential narratives, and what are the kind of themes, heroes, villains, and endings. Now, if you stop and look at this, you'll see some rhetorical devices in there, like rapid and radical transformation, which is kind of very nicely written, makes it sound more emphatic. But if we try and break down the argument here, essentially what's happening is someone is drawing an equivalence between transformation of society and the wishes of citizens and individuals, and they're drawing a comparison between that and the way that the health service should be governed. So essentially what they're saying is it's a form of consumerism, treating healthcare in the same way that citizens as individuals respond to new technologies. So there's a story then which is basically society is changing, therefore we need to change the health service. Now that might sound compelling, but if we think about an alternative story, you could argue society is changing, so therefore the one thing that we need to make sure stays the same is how we provide healthcare, which is not a good in the same way that technology or shopping or contemporary other contemporary goods are. So there's a potential other story that can be told here, and the exercise gives you a clearer way of thinking about the same thing. Now this is actually from the same year, and it was a policy document for the BBC. I won't go read through it all in detail, but basically building public value was a document whose main objective was to argue that the BBC should retain its licence fee, which is almost a form of taxation. They don't generate revenue through advertising or sponsorship. They generate revenue through it being a legal requirement for citizens with a TV licence to pay a fee. So it's like a forced subscription service. Now what's interesting about this is it's also talking about a change in society, so limitless individual consumer choice, a digital world, market-driven drift. So it's many of the same themes as the Choosing Health paper, rapid and radical transformation, needs and wishes of citizens as individuals. So it's saying the same sort of thing in terms of change in society. But what's really interesting is it makes the exact opposite argument that the white paper on Choosing Health does. So it says a renewed BBC will counterbalance that drift towards programme making as a commodity. Only a secure and adequately funded BBC can ensure broadcasting retains its cultural aspiration. So you've got both documents are telling completely different stories, but starting from the same basic premises, which is the world is changing. So the NHS white paper document is saying the world is changing, so the NHS needs to change. And the BBC document is saying the world is changing, therefore the BBC needs to be protected and to stay the same. So that example just shows the differences in a narrative or rhetorical approach versus content analysis. Because if we went through content analysis, we might see similarities in terms of needs and wishes of citizens as individuals and limitless individual consumer choice. The content is quite similar in that respect, but it's being packaged in a completely different way. And so when it comes to thinking about documents, documentary data, these other data sources that you might have to access, you have got a real world of possibilities, because you're not bound by the content of the document, you're looking more at how that content is organised and put together. So let's think a bit more about some of the slightly more advanced themes, language, discourse, and I'll say some more about narrative and rhetoric. So language then is, in a way, the 20th century philosophy can be characterised as being fascinated with language. A lot of the great contributions in understanding philosophy were relating to language, the limits of language. And some powerful ideas that language is a shared activity. You can't have completely private or personal language, and it's a means of exercising power. So when we think about documents, they're based in language, of course, but they're not simply representing the world. They are creating the world. They're a means of exercising power. And there's this really interesting idea by Foucault, which is of a discursive practice. So he says that language and texts, important texts, and also talk as well, is situated. That is, it takes place in a certain context, and it reflects that kind of social and cultural context. It's not about a transcendental status. So it's not about mapping a piece of qualitative data onto the world like it would be with content analysis. It's more about understanding the broader context for, that text or that talk. So truth is the practices and functions of a community rather than having a transcendental status. So just going back to the example of the white paper, we don't just see that as a policy document that's been handed down almost like, the word of God. It's not just been given to us, it's been created in a particular setting. So when you're understanding how to analyse it, you need to think about who authored it, for whom, what's the story, how else could it have been written, those sorts of things. Another important aspect of language is that the labels we use in the social sciences actually create the world. And that's what Giddens means by a double hermeneutic. So we're not like the physicist calculating the mass of an object, which is independent of our observations, really. When we try and understand, reform or policy or what's happening in a company document or an organisational text, we're not like physicists in a laboratory weighing the mass, calculating the mass of something. Our very analysis creates that reality of that object itself, and that object is not just factual or given to us as if it was by the word of God. It's something that is created in a context, written by somebody for a certain purpose with an audience in mind. So that's another shift from content analysis as a kind of realist approach to analysing documents to narrative and rhetoric. In terms of discourse, a lot could be said about discourse. Mainly when we think about discourse, we think about analysing qualitative data such as interviews. But again, this is just to mention that this idea of natural talk, which in a way is the goal of some discourse analysts, they want to find data that passes the dead social science researcher tests. Documentary data accomplishes that because it's already out there. So even though it creates the world, and it's situated and you need to understand it in a context, the value of documentary data is it is there. You can't debate at a very fundamental level that there is a white paper, an NHS policy paper called Choosing Health. How we understand it you could debate, but you wouldn't sensibly debate what it says and what's in it. And that's a really great advantage of documentary data. Let's think a bit more deeply about narrative and rhetoric, which is I'm suggesting is a really interesting potential way if you're trying to rework your research design to think about how you might look at text, you might look at qualitative data. So the thing about documents is they are authored and created. Even some of the most factual seeming documents like a statement of accounts, an annual report, statement to the shareholders, these things are authored and they're created. And they are created with an audience in mind. So in that sense, what I've argued quite successfully in a lot of different papers is we can think of them as stories or narratives. I won't go into, there are potential differences between the terms, but I won't go into that. I'm going to say what Yanis Gabriel says, which is that story is sometimes used as a posh word. Sorry, narrative is sometimes used as a posh word for story. So I'm going to treat stories and narratives as the same. But if you accept that organisational documents, seemingly non-fiction, factual documents, can be treated as stories, that opens up a whole world of possibilities when it comes to analysing those data. And this is what's exciting about documentary analysis, because you can use some of the techniques that have been used in literary criticism to analyse narratives and stories that are fictional. You can use those same techniques even with seemingly factual, everyday documents like exit interviews, company policy, interview data from select committee testimony, corporate minutes and memos, and so on. You can use the same techniques that that are used to analyse fictional documents in the same way that you use to analyse organisational documents. Another way of saying this is there aren't any factual documents from this perspective. All documents are created and authored. They don't just represent the truth, they always are a kind of story, a kind of way of presenting the truth. Now, one approach which I've used quite a lot, and there's a really wonderful article which is cited in the resources later on, I'll put that up as a slide later on, by Barry and Elmson Strategic Management Journal, I believe, is how are stories effective? And they draw on these two ideas of credibility and defamiliarization or novelty. Defamiliarization is like putting a spin on something so that you see it in a new light. And this argument comes from a particular approach, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, to analysing documents as narratives, called formalism. And so basically an interesting question you can ask is, how do documents establish credibility and novelty? So if we go back to the examples of the white paper, how does that establish credibility? Well, it states at the beginning that it's contemporary, right? So it's written at a certain point in time, at the start of the 21st century. And it's almost portraying the change as an inevitable change because of that. It's contemporary, and we need to reflect the rapid and radical transformation of English society. So that's how it's establishing credibility. And the paper as a whole uses a kind of defamiliarization, a kind of spin on the idea of choice. So that's a very influential policy paper. It's on choosing health is the title, and that's kind of making a link between the kinds of choices you make as citizens, as individuals with technology or consumer goods, making a link between that kind of choice and the kind of choice you have for healthcare. So that's one example of the kind of credibility and novelty, how that's accomplished in that very small, short passage. There's the role of rhetoric. So what things are contrasted with each other, what things are emphasised, are there pairs that go together, sometimes what's called collocation. So there might be some words like rights is always in New Labour's language, New Labour that was in power earlier this century. Rights and responsibilities always go together. So what's happening with those pairs, it's suggesting that there aren't any free rights, they always come with duties. And you pay attention to things like what things are celebrated and made to be heroic, and what things are seen as villainous or wrong. And think about in stories what the ending is, what the implied ending is, and whether there could be alternative endings. So the white paper that I've given the example of several times, the implied ending is we have a new method of choosing health, so that it's like the kinds of choices that citizens as individuals make in other domains. But an alternative ending could have been we need to keep the NHS the same, given the amount of change there is in contemporary society. A very brief definition, more can be said about this on narrative, is a representation of events. It's quite difficult actually to define in clear and precise terms what a narrative is, but we do have an inbuilt competence for understanding stories, so we can recognise stories. Rhetoric is kind of how texts or talk are organised, and there's this distinction from a school of literary criticism called Russian formalism, which is really helpful and valuable when it comes to thinking about documents, and that's between fabula and, I haven't pronounced it correctly, suzet. Fabula is the content of what's told in a narrative, it's the events that are related, and suzet is how those events are put together. So in a narrative you have a representation of events, so there are the events that are communicated, but you also have them represented in a certain way. So and part of that will be about how things are contrasted, emphasised, and so on. So narrative is like the content of what's told together with how that content is put together. Rhetoric is how texts or talk are organised. So a bit more on formalism then. So I mentioned earlier credibility and defamiliarization. Credibility is quite straightforward. So there are a number of ways in which organisational documents establish credibility. A very quick example would be an annual report. So when you get an annual report, you're going to get lots and lots and lots of facts and figures. And all these numbers are communicating, important information, but they're also meta-communicating. That is, they're also communicating something above what they're actually saying. They're also meta-communicating this idea of credibility. You can't doubt these numbers. This is the implicit message of a lot of corporate messaging. Defamiliarization is a little different, and there's a really brilliant essay by this guy, Victor Shklovsky, in Artist Technique, and there's a wonderful passage in it where he says about poetry that what the poets do is they help you recover the sensation of life, and that is to have the very mundane is made somehow magical. And he says art exists to make you feel things. So things that have been in the past, you wouldn't necessarily pay any attention to them, almost a bit like corporate organisational documents, they become completely new. And he takes the very familiar object of a stone. He says that what poets do, for instance, is they take a stone and they make you realise how stony it is. So you have the very mundane, but it's kind of reimagined and repackaged. And so it's the way in which a narrative is told that is really important from this perspective. So you have credibility and defamiliarization. So let's have a look then. I'll try and talk through quite quickly examples of where I've used these ideas and where I've used existing documents to some success in these different domains. I'll go through the first two really quickly, and I'll spend a little bit longer on journal articles. You can skip to the end if you just want the resources. I'm going to go through about 14 journal articles, I think, which, on the one hand, it's good because it shows how it's been successful in a number of different routes, but you also might get a bit fed up with me talking about those things. But I think it's helpful to do that from my perspective, to share with you how there are things that I've learned about using documents over time. And it's been quite successful personally, taking this approach of looking at documents as kind of found data, given data, from a narrative or from a rhetorical perspective. So in terms of practice, so one of the good things about if you have, because I've said before that with documentary data it encourages ingenuity, and what that means is you actually end up making a methodological contribution. So when you're analysing the data, you have kind of empirical contribution, maybe if you're bringing to light documents people haven't looked at, but you can have a methodological contribution as well, which is your way of analysing them. And that can stand as a separate and independent contribution from the theoretical contribution that you make. And I've said already, with documents, you're not constrained or restricted to the type of theoretical contribution that you make. But the good thing, if you do use and successfully work with documents and you make this kind of methodological contribution, what it means is that you are then, it's like a toolkit that you have. So you're able to respond to different kinds of documents using that same methodological toolkit. So these are some of the places where I've been interviewed or I've published for practitioner pieces on rhetoric or narrative. And one of the advantages of that is you can use some of the same techniques that I've learned over time and applied to policy literature, applied to other organisational documents, and comment on contemporaneous events. So as was then contemporaneous in terms of, the Clinton versus Trump campaign was a good contemporary phenomenon at the time that I could comment on using rhetoric and narrative analysis, and similarly with Brexit as well. So if you go down this route and you develop skills in analysing documents, you can apply them to a wide range of phenomena. So that is really a real benefit because because documents are all around us. So if you develop skills in documentary analysis, it can be useful for commenting and entering debates. In terms of books, well, quite a few of the books that I've written have been theoretical rather than empirical. There are empirical cases in the two on the left, the ethical business and realities of work. And there's quite a lot of empirical data in the book on policing and public management. But a lot of my interest goes back to a monograph that I wrote in 2012 on organisation, society and politics and Aristotelian perspective, because it's from Aristotle and his work, the Rhetoric, that we can still learn so much. You can actually use this 2,500-year-old document to deconstruct contemporary policy texts even now, even in the 21st century. the tools and techniques that Aristotle taught us can still be applied and picked up quite quickly. And this book from last year on critical perspectives on leadership is it's not purely theoretical and conceptual, because it looks at analysing texts. So it is kind of using, together with Mark Lemont, it is using documents as a kind of source of empirical data. In terms of journals, so these are some of the journals that I've mentioned, and the reason for putting these up is they're all they're all kind of well-regarded journals in their field, but I've been able to publish in each in quite different areas, so leadership, accounting, public administration, management education, ethics, and general management studies, using the same kinds of methods and approach of documentary analysis. Let's go through each of these, and I can mention, you can skip to the end if you just want the resources. But so this first paper, they're in chronological order rather than thematic. In leadership, what I did was I looked at leaders' speeches and tried to, showed how they used rhetorical devices in a similar way to other written texts, like what are called aphorisms. So an aphorism is short, pithy saying, and some of the most powerful aphorisms have these rhetorical devices in them, which are taken from a way of looking at rhetoric called conversation analysis. And what it suggests is that you can, what's interesting I think about this, and kind of backs up my point about the difference between fact and fiction, is I did a comparative analysis of the forum speech by Marcus Antonius in Julius Caesar, the one that starts friends, Romans, countrymen, Lemurians, and Churchill's first speech as Prime Minister. And what I find quite interesting about political speeches is that they are kind of halfway between talk and text, because they're very often extremely crafted documents. They're highly unnatural, even though they sound, they kind of sound easy to follow. If you take something like a State of the Union address by someone like Obama, who was a very skilled orator, that could be treated as talk, but actually it's much closer to the text because many people will have written on it. So once you make that argument, you can then bring in techniques from analysing talk to analysing what are kind of textual documents. So that's kind of what's interesting about that paper, I think, the comparison and contrast between a very famous real-life speech and speech in Shakespeare. Policy as narrative. So this is actually where the example that I showed earlier of the white paper Choosing Health, I deconstructed that paper in this review style paper. And this was, again, it was like taking a piece of found data, a document, and treating it as empirical data. And this used, this looked at certain key themes. You can get that from looking at the abstract. So it thought about who it's authored for, what story is it telling, what potential other stories can be told, what are the key themes, how are those themes put together. So you've got these ideas of rhetoric and also of narrative in there. And it was arguing that policy making is like a form of storytelling. In this paper in the Journal of Management Studies, what I did was attacked another way of reviewing the literature, which is basically the systematic review and the evidence-based approach. Actually haven't gone into this in detail, but what I would say, someone who's been very critical of systematic reviews, that's a really great methodological avenue for you at the moment. If you are not able to collect data, you could follow the steps in a systematic review, and that could be a valuable contribution. This is somebody who's been speaking as somebody who's been very critical of systematic reviews. But here you can see it uses that formalist technique, credibility and defamiliarization, and it says, right, let's look at the work by this group of scholars who are basically claiming to be scientific and objective, impartial, their stuff is transparent and so on. They have a technique, they're pragmatic, and let's look at what they're saying, but treat it as a story. Look at how it establishes credibility, how it establishes defamiliarization. So that was in one paper. This is a kind of theory piece as well, and it was kind of, again, going back to Aristotle, it's got a section in this paper on how you might use narrative to understand policy and public administration and the idea of the public good. In what way might you use stories to analyse these things? So one potential implication for you if you're doing a project, thesis or a dissertation, when it comes to the back end of the dissertation or thesis, you probably would need to say something about the research implications. And if you have gone down this route of doing documentary analysis and you've used this ingenuity in pursuing a method, you'll be well placed to talk about methodological implications for others, so what other people should do. So don't just think of the method of the narrative and the rhetorical analysis as featuring just in the review and the analysis section. It also will come into implications. Rhetoric in policy text. So this was another example. I worked with good friend and colleague Alistair Hewison. He's from a very different disciplinary background from nursing, and we've worked well looking at policy texts and the role of rhetoric, and how this idea of enthymeme, which is an Aristotelian device, we look for this device on enthymeme. If you look it up, and there's not scope in this presentation to go through it, but if you look it up and learn about it, you will find this popping up absolutely everywhere in almost every document that is written by a company, an organisation, a senior manager, employees. You know, when people are trying to make arguments, they use this device, enthymeme, all over the place. I can guarantee you that if you are interested in a data source, category of documents, you can look through that source through the lens of enthymeme, and you'll find you'll find examples of that. And this is quite a nice route through to making a kind of contribution, just looking at documents. So enthymeme, essentially, if you have an argument, a classical argument, what would be called a syllogism, an example of that might be Socrates as a man, that would be called a major premise. All men are mortal, that's called a minor premise. And then the conclusion would be, therefore Socrates is mortal. What happens in enthymeme is the minor premise is missed out, or one or more premises in the argument aren't spelled out. I can't go into that much detail on it, but I can guarantee you if you're looking at a category of documents that interests you and you look through this lens, that will be a contribution. Private equity and the public good. So this was kind of rhetorical contrast between private equity and what the public good is, and looking at a business model with a former colleague, Ian Clark, looking at a business model and trying to develop rhetorical contrast between the private equity and public good. And this again was, looking at data that was already out there, the kinds of claims made about the private equity business model and how that could be contrasted with this idea of the public good. Evidence-based dialectics. So this was probably the most theory-heavy piece on here, in a great journal organisation, and it was essentially saying you can set up a dialectic between people that are for something and against something. And similarly with enthymeme, another way that you can look at documents, if you can categorise them into different camps, is through dialectic. So one camp is saying A, the other camp is saying not A or B, and then trying to understand the relationship between those two. Many works in philosophy have been following this kind of format, taking one school and a rival school, connecting them together and developing contributions. So that's another potential route through to a contribution. Take a category of documents, analyse them in terms of a for one position and against, or for one position and for a contrasting position, and then look at how you can link those together using dialectics. In this paper, this does actually have interview data in it, so it's not quite the same as the paper itself is not quite the same as what I'm advocating, which is just to use documents. But where it's relevant is this uses an account of how to analyse fairy tales, and it applies it to seemingly completely different world, which is accounting, and what people say to HMRC, which is the Customs and Excise, the tax body in the UK. And what we found quite quite amazingly, there was quite a correspondence between the logic of the fairy tale and the kind of logic that drove these presentations of accounts. So if you remember what I say about a narrative as representation of events, this paper showed how the way that fairy tales are represented and the way that people represent the governance of taxation, seemingly completely worlds apart. There were a lot of parallels in those, and so it's kind of extending this basic argument that you can look at what are seemingly factual documents as though they are works of fiction. This paper does also look at interview data, but the reason for mentioning it is that it included a section of analysis of select committee testimony, and there's some fantastic data available in the US and in the UK on select committees. A lot of it is up there as text, but you can also see it as video. So one of the advantages of that is you can give a much kind of richer account of what's happening, because sometimes documents can be a little bit dry and a little bit restricted to the text, but in select committee testimony you often can see videos. The same could be said of like press briefings and so on. But this paper was interesting to me, thinking about documents and documentary analysis, because it showed just how rich the data on select committee testimony is. The thing about select committees, or something like in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they also receive written submissions. So if you can find a select committee that is relevant to your area, you will be able to access interview data, albeit you haven't carried it out, it's been carried out by the select committee, and you'll also be able to analyse written submissions. So you've got the potential for triangulation there. You'll often also have a dialectic. You'll often have one camp advocating more or less regulation and the other camp arguing the other. This paper in Academy of Management Learning and Education was, this is like a kind of extension of the paper I mentioned in JMS, and again it was treating work in that journal, previous publications in that journal, a lot of it, as if they were primary data, and also as if they were stories rather than factual texts. And what's so appealing to me about that approach with this is that people who are for evidence-based management do often portray themselves and portray their method as though it's arrived from the gods, completely factual, independent, neutral, objective, and so on, and they emphasize things like transparency, replicability, systematization, technique, and so on, whereas actually they're telling a story just like the rest of us, is my view. The final one on evidence-based management, I think, in these papers, this one is in British Journal of Management, and this took a particular perspective from Foucault and his idea of an archaeology. And he talks about this in The Order of Things, and essentially it's linked to his idea of discursive practice that I mentioned earlier. The idea being that claims, documents, seemingly factual documents, are always situated in a kind of broader historical, social, cultural category. And so it looks at the difference between evidence and narrative, juxtaposing those two, placing those two off against one another, and tries to trace back to, I think it's the 18th century that took it back to, older accounts of the distinction between evidence and narrative. And this was really good fun, actually, because what it used was a fictional novel by a guy called Lawrence Stern, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, it's called, and it's an amazing book. It plays with narrative, plays with stories. It's written hundreds of years ago, but it seems so contemporary because of the devices that it used, and plays with time and things like that. So it took that fictional document and it took a factual approach, which is by Locke, his essay concerning human understanding, which some people trace the origins of contemporary psychology to. So, it was a lot of fun writing that paper, actually, because it was, it started this thing of being forced to be forced ingenuity. You have to think about a new angle, a new perspective, a new technique, a new method, a new approach, because you're dealing with things with which we're very familiar. An academic journal article. In this paper, Critical Leadership Studies, again, we were taking, this was led by Mark Learmonth, we were taking, work that had already been published and treating it as a story and looking at it as being problematic, just in the way that it used the term leadership. And so this was very much about the rhetoric of leader, what's happening when we use the word leader or leadership. And there's a good example of how you can't use terms in the way that I said earlier. It's not like a physicist evaluating mass. You can't use terms, in a kind of neutral way. They always have certain effects, they always have implications. And if you're interested in the theory behind that, it's to do with performativity. And in a similar way as enthymeme, I said, could be one route through to a contribution. Dialectics could be one route through to a contribution. Similarly, if you look at performativity, which is the Austin's idea that words don't simply communicate meaning, they also have effects. That could be another route through to a contribution, and you could look at texts just as much as you could look at interviews. So in terms of the resources then, I won't read through all these, I'll just put them up, you can pause them if you want to look at them. So those are some of the references in reading to do with qualitative methods and discourse. These are the papers that I've gone through. I didn't actually cover the second one there, Curious Case of Corporate Social Responsibility and Conflict Minerals, but I did allude to how the Securities and Exchange Commission takes both written submissions and oral submissions, and that we're building on the work of Juliana Reinecker. That piece looks at the SEC, and it takes two camps: those who are arguing for more legislation in relation to conflict minerals and those who are arguing for less. The other ones up there are all the papers that I've shown an image of the abstract of. And then finally, let's just adjust that, sorry. Bear with me a second, apologies for this. Somehow it's older. So the final thing on there is I've put together a YouTube playlist that you can access with that link, and it's got resources that are relevant to analysing documents and also qualitative data more generally. And that's just an example of there's the 9 DBAs. It's for a DBA audience, but it's relevant for M-level dissertations and PhDs, on various tips on different aspects of the research process. So I hope that's of some use to you if you are thinking, if you're struggling right now with how to change your research design. That's the intended audience for the presentation. I hope it's useful, and good luck.